to the last paper, we've been told before lunch that periphery in Israel is quite important for mobility. Just to put things in context, when we talk about periphery, it's usually something between 60 to 100 kilometers. We are going to have now a paper about Canadian landscape, and that just to remind yourselves, it's something completely different. So we are honored to have Miles Corak talk about the divided landscape of economic opportunity, the Canadian geography of intergenerational mobility.
Change the title.
Oh yeah, sure, I'm changing the title, but that's the title of the paper, and I'm actually going to mash up two papers here just to give my discussant an interesting time. But the essence is the paper that's available. So 50 to 100 kilometers gets you to the periphery.
The entire country is, you know.
Yeah, I know. That's it's like a walk after lunch for Canadians.
Yeah. From there is measured.
For sure. It's really quite impressive. I actually wanted to begin my talk with a map of Canada and then superimpose a map of Israel on it, but you can just imagine what that would look like. I'm very pleased to be here and to particularly follow the last sessions with the papers by Heller and Aloni, which I thought really put Israel on the map in terms of the kinds of work that most economists do in intergenerational mobility. So the subtext here is that I hope that they continue to pursue their research and maybe look subnationally. I think that would be of value, particularly given the kinds of discussions we've had, not just about the barriers across different identities, but maybe that overlays in space. That's the subtext. Maybe I'd like to begin my paper with a little bit of motivation. I'd like to do that by showing you three pictures that have changed the world, or at least my small part of the world. The first one is this picture, and you all know who this is, of course. This is Shania Twain, the famous country pop artist, who arose in the 1990s to be one of the best-selling artists in the entire world. She rode the wave of a new technology called the compact disc to accomplish that. Her start as a professional was in Nashville, Tennessee, of course, and she owns this palatial home on the shores of Lake Geneva. And you still have a chance to see her as you plan your next holidays at Caesar's Palace in Las Vegas. The other thing about Shania Twain is that she was born in a part of Canada that I was born in Northern Ontario. And if you read her biography, it's really quite an astounding story. This is a woman who started life at the very bottom of the socioeconomic rung, not just in Canada, but very likely in many of the rich countries, and rose to the very top. She was one of five siblings who had three different biological fathers. There is a hint in her biography that her mother suffered from a disability, probably depression. The formative man in her experience was her stepfather, who was a native person, a member of the First Nations Reserve from the Temagami Reserve in Northern Ontario, and he left the reserve and married this woman. There's a hint of clearly of abuse in the household, of moving from home to home almost every year or every second year, at one point living in a basement apartment with a dirt floor. And to top it off, the woman's parents died in a car accident when she was in her early 20s, and she was left to raise her younger siblings. And she makes a lot more money than I do, and probably everyone else in the room. And this is an amazing story of upward mobility. And I think it should motivate research, the determinants of mobility and the capacity for a child to become all he or she can be. Certainly there was a little bit of luck in what she did, but I'll leave you to read the biography on your own. It's also interesting that this Canadian moved to the United States to make it big. So the theme here is this capacity to move upward, and that should be a public policy priority. The second picture is the picture that Alan alluded to earlier, the famous Great Gatsby curve, and it's such an honor for me to be here with Marcus and Joe, who foreshadowed this picture, and of course with Alan, who used an amazing megaphone to make it much more policy relevant. If you haven't read Alan's speech that he gave in January 2012 to the Center for American Progress, you should do that. It was on the top of my reading list for months and months, as you can imagine, until my 17-year-old daughter told me she didn't want to hear that as a bedtime story anymore. But the value of it, of course, is the capacity to make international comparisons, and it's a great, I think, accomplishment to see Israel now placed on this chart. But there's a caution here as well. Not all of these comparisons are policy relevant. I think we've learned that the challenges that Israel faces are very common to many other countries, but the contexts and the institutions and the feasible policy options are also very different. And so when we make comparisons like this, they are great communication devices for motivating deeper discussions. In the United States, this curve really served its purpose in moving social mobility or intergenerational mobility up on the policy circles. But unfortunately, some of the comparisons are made, I think, are sort of less helpful. In the New York Times story that sort of broke this discussion by Jason DePaul, he began with a discussion, as most journalists do, of the extremes, the United States compared to Denmark. And as much as we all like Denmark, I don't think you can turn the United States into Denmark, and there's some fundamental differences in the societies, not just institutional constraints, but also the basic choices they make and the values they profess. So I'm going to argue that perhaps a better comparison for the United States is Canada. And I will, in Canadian circles, this graph is always sort of held up as a major accomplishment for Canada, showing that the country is much more intergenerational mobile than a country that we're often inclined to compare ourselves to. But I think Americans probably can learn from that comparison more than they can learn from others. And as you pursue this agenda, you should cautiously imagine what the relevant comparisons are when we move this to policy discussion. But as valuable as international comparisons are, I think this third picture also changed the world, or at least the discussion amongst intergenerational mobility policymakers. And this is a map, one of several drawn from Raj Chetty and Nathan Hendren and others' paper in the Quarterly Journal of Economics, showing the degree of relative movement in the United States. We don't have to talk about what the actual figure is, we'll talk about that later. But the point is that what falls out of here for policy recommendations is that maybe comparisons within the country are more important than comparisons between countries. Maybe understanding, for example, that there's a great deal of mobility in Utah and not so much in Georgia is more relevant for the US discussion than the fact that there's more mobility in Denmark than there is in the United States. And there's certain value to that. But I think there's also a certain caution. As we look inward, perhaps our policy horizon becomes a little bit more constrained and we lose sight of the bigger ideas, the bigger factors that are pushing things that still remain relevant, still remain feasible, and yet we begin to sort of tinker on smaller margins. So I'm going to argue that perhaps the next wave in international work is to look between and within countries. And so I will give you a Canadian version of this map, and then I'll give you a Canada-US version of this map to highlight differences between the countries. And I want to do it in a way, I think, that points to some fundamental differences and barriers, which I hope an Israeli audience can also appreciate. And if you don't really move those big barriers, or if you don't want to, or if those are aspects of social choice, then maybe you are at an optimal level of social mobility. Okay. So that's where I'm going. Here is just some polling data from a paper I did some years ago that was sponsored by the Pew Charitable Trusts, in which Pew had gone off to Americans and asked them what they understood the American dream to be. And they helped me do a similar poll in Canada. and with a very similarly worded question. And so what you should get from this is that Canadians and Americans have a similar vision of the good life. This is the fraction of individuals in our survey. It was a representative survey conducted by reputable polling organizations that answered 8 or higher on a 10-point scale of whether you understand these different characteristics to represent the Canadian or the American dream. And you don't even have to use statistical significance tests. I was really quite shocked. The point estimates in many cases are spot on for both countries. Canadians tend possibly to be a little bit less entrepreneurial. Owning your own business is more of an aspect of the American dream in the United States than it is the Canadian dream for Canadians. But the point here is, well, maybe in the way we define what we want to accomplish in life, it's very similar. And so that the differences that we observe in between countries are not, in some sense, the result of social choice. All right. So my major messages are, first of all, to pick up on some themes we've already discussed, and certainly Mark has touched on these things yesterday, but it's also interesting to look at, hear the perspective of sociologists in the room, is that we need to hold on to more than one thought in our minds to understand what upward mobility is. We have some structure in the statistical measures we use from economic theory or from sociological theory, be it class definitions or be it log linear regressions. These are motivated by theory, but theory does not give us complete guidance. We can also go to the intuitions and the instincts of policymakers and policy advocates, and they also point us to other directions. For example, Raj Chetty's notion of absolute mobility, that came from the New York Times reporter David Leonhardt, who told him, why don't you look at this aspect? And so you can see theory sort of putting certain blinders on us, policymakers are telling us other things, and we should be open to that. And I want to suggest that theory doesn't give me, as an empiricist, a really good guidance on the social welfare implications of these statistics. So maybe it's responsible for me as an empiricist to be agnostic in the measures that I use. And I suggest sociologists might also value that lesson. Structured in our thinking, but still agnostic. And so I hope that message comes out in the way I conduct this paper. Now, certainly upward mobility as rags to riches in the Shania Twain sense has a good deal of resonance in policy circles, but it can't be the whole story. I mean, it's an obvious mathematical fact that if you want to take children in the bottom 20% and move them to the top 20%, somebody is going to have to leave the top 20%. And so we have to be concerned about movements throughout the whole distribution, particularly trying to break out of the bottom, trying to move out of the bottom, and then trying to understand movement out of the top. So if there are strong intergenerational cycles of poverty or very strong intergenerational cycles of privilege, that's also going to affect the degree of possible rags to riches movement. We should also, in our thinking, adopt both absolute and relative measures. Movement has to be based on some sort of income growth, and how that determines is going to change our vision of ranks. So finally, the third sort of message I want to leave you with is to promote upward mobility, I think, is about more than just efficient cream skimming of the most innately talented children. So yes, it would be really unfortunate if a child with the talents and the energies of a Shania Twain does not become all that she can be. But that shouldn't be the only goal of public policy. For me, I think the priority should be lowering the risks of intergenerational cycles of poverty for all children so that they can make whatever movements they have in them to move forward. And sometimes we lose a sight of that, or we feel that linking this up to a growth agenda in which we promote mobility and promote talents will somehow promote growth. Laudable as that is, it can't be the whole story. So those are the big takeaways of the paper. So let me perhaps move into the empirics by saying that it's nice to say we pursue this goal of allowing children to become all that they can be, but we don't have a good counterfactual of that. So we rely on relative to the previous generation as a marker for that, rely on relative to our counterparts in the current generation, and we rely on the counterfactual being relative to those elsewhere. And I'll sort of incorporate all those counterfactuals in my measures in some way, in a very loose sense. The other thing that's important is if we're concerned about upward mobility, then this is a question of directional movement. And so we have to, as I suggested, think in our statistics about rank and relative movements, but also absolute movements in income. I'm going to let you read this quote from a very nice book by the Harvard economist Benjamin Freeman, who talks about the interaction between absolute and relative mobility that sort of goes missing in the theoretical discussions that I'm accustomed to. And I'm sort of calling out to theorists to give me support in understanding how relatives and absolutes are related. And I really don't know what kinds of weights to put on my alternative measures. But there's nothing like seeing the economic pie shrink before your very eyes to make you wonder more about your relative share and the prospects of your children. And perhaps that's what was happening in the United States during the Great Recession that brought inequality to the fore. And Benjamin Freeman suggests that if we have absolute mobility, maybe we care a little bit less about our relative position because the counterfactual is more internally based, as sort of Marcus was hinting at in an earlier discussion. So we're going to have to, in our measures of mobility, focus on incomes. There's no doubt about that. And that's being sort of downplayed recently, I think, in part because of the force of the Chetty-Hendron paper. But I still think it's very important to have income mobility statistics. We should be cautious in our estimates that we're not only focusing on beta, the extra kick you get from having a parent above average, or the disadvantage you get from having a parent below average, but also alpha, which is some measure of absolute growth. Both of these coefficients, along with the average level of parental income, determine, or in a statistical sense, determine your income level as an adult. So in this equation, I use the index J to refer to the fact that within, to mark the regions within the country. So for every region in the country, we have an alpha, we have a beta, and we have an average community income level. And income mobility is going to be the outcome of that process. There are some obvious measurement errors that we must address, and I'll just skip over this to let you know that I did handle those things by averaging, for example, parental income over a 5-year frame and picking it up at particularly the child's income at an appropriate stage in the life cycle. I'll define that in a second. Here you have the data, which is tax data. The same kind of data that was used in, I gather, in the Israeli paper that was given in the session before. The entire cohort I'm interested in measures about 3.3 million children. These are children born between 63 and 1970. And in my data, I have about 2 million of those, and I have some weights in the data to make it about 3 million. Some of the observations I've dropped because of averaging in incomes and other concerns about quality. I've listed this data for each of the 10 Canadian provinces and for the 3 territories, the Yukon, the Northwest Territories, and Nunavut. You can get a sense of the size here. These are data from the income tax system, so they're good measures of income. And very fine measures of location are available from the postal code information that is submitted with the income tax information. Obviously, there are some drawbacks from this data. There aren't any, it's not a rich set of correlates, so I don't have anything like education or occupation in the data. We're concerned about incomes, but we are also concerned about position or rank. And I'm going to use lowercase letters to refer to the percentile rank of the children and the percentile rank of the parents in their own income distribution after incomes have been averaged over 5 years. I also not only averaged the parents' income over the 5 years, but I also averaged the child's income between the years 2003 and 2008, when the children are between the ages of 38 and 45. We need to correct for measurement error on both sides of that. And so running this little regression gives you a sense of absolute rank mobility and relative rank mobility. And so we saw in the Israeli case, if I interpreted correct, that this B is about 0.24. Did I get that right? Yeah, okay. And here you have estimates for the provinces when the children are 38, 35. For Canada, overall, the estimate is 0.24. So in terms of rank, relative mobility, the two countries get exactly the same results, assuming everything else is comparable. There is a certain amount of variation in this. The province of Manitoba sticks out as having lower rank, less absolute rank mobility, and less relative rank mobility. Okay, and I've done a little exercise in this column to look at these estimates at age 31 and 32. This is the time frame that Chetty and Hendron and others used in that quarterly journal paper. And interestingly, the results, at least at the national level, are pretty well the same. So their result that life cycle issues are less sort of important in rank measures, interestingly, comes out in these data. Okay, so we've got 3 statistics associated with income. We have 2 more statistics associated with rank. And then I'm going to suggest that we should focus on 3 cells of the quintile transition matrix: the chances of a rags to riches movement, the chances of an intergenerational cycle of poverty, and the chances of an intergenerational cycle of privilege, if I can label these transition probablities in that colloquial sense. Okay. So now I have. I'll tell you what's going on here. This is the Chetty-Hendron data. This is the probability that a child born to parents in the top 5th of the income distribution will end up as an adult in the top 5th of the income distribution. And along here is the probability that a child of parents in the bottom 5th will rise to the top 5th. Remember, everything here is defined in terms of the national income distribution. Okay, so that adding up constraint I referred to earlier, we've got more slack in it. And it's interesting, at least for me, that there's, for a large part of this distribution, a positive correlation. Okay? So the greater the intergenerational cycle of privilege, the more the chances that children from the very bottom will rise to the top. All right? So that ceiling at the top, that glass ceiling that might prevent children from rising to the top, doesn't seem to be kicking in here. All right? Where it does kick in is here. Oops, what have I done? Is here. This is now the intergenerational cycle of poverty. This is the chances that a child raised in the bottom 5th will grow up to become an adult in the bottom 5th, and I'm correlating it with the movement from the bottom 5th to the top 5th, and there's a strong negative correlation. And this is what I was referring to earlier. Maybe if we reduce these odds for everybody, the chances of some of those others moving all the way to the top are going to increase as well. So it's not like privilege is putting a brake on that kind of movement. These were for the American data, and here is the Canadian data I use. Each dot here is one of 266 census divisions. All right? And the Chetty-Hendron, the previous dots you saw, were 700 odd commuting zones. And that's why my subtitle of the paper was 1,000 regions. But you see the same pattern in the Canadian data, although the levels are different. Okay? Can I pause here just for a second, just to be sure when using the same vocabulary? Are there any questions of clarification? Yeah.
I'm not sure I understand. What are the dots? What do they represent?
Okay.
Individuals?
Okay, let me that's exactly what I want to be clear on. So the Canadian geography is divided into 266 regions. For each of those regions, I go into that region with the data and I estimate all of my intergenerational mobility statistics. So each dot here refers to the probability in the quintile transition matrix that an individual raised in the bottom fifth of the income distribution will rise to the top fifth for that community. So it's as if I had a dot here for Jerusalem, for Tel Aviv, and so on. Okay? Does that help? No?
So how does it go on both axes?
Well, these are the probabilities of the cycle of poverty, and these are the rags to riches movement, the movement from the bottom quintile to the top quintile, across 266 census divisions.
So what you're showing us for Canada is that mobility is correlated with mobility, and immobility is negatively correlated with mobility.
Mm-hmm.
That's what you're showing.
Mm-hmm.
No?
Mm-hmm.
So that begs the question: why in the States there was this?
It's the same. Well, roughly the same.
On the left side, it's not clear.
It's not clear down here. You mean?
Yeah. That's
Yeah.
how-
Okay, so a little bit different down there. Now remember, right now, the quintile transition matrices are defined according to the income distributions in each country. Okay? So levels of income could be different. What it means to be in the bottom fifth could be very different. So we'll put Canada in the U.S. distribution towards the.
So, for example, if you take there's an outlier right at the top there, right, and just a bit to the right, my right, down there. Yes.
Here?
Where is that? That's a place where there's a tremendous probability of moving from rags to riches.
Well,
Which are these places?
well, we can go to the Cheney Hedron data. They have a spreadsheet, and they can give you the names. You know, is it in Utah? Is it
We
in?
don't know them.
Well, I don't know them off the heart. There's 700 here.
No, I meant the Canadian picture.
Oh, the Canadian picture.
Yeah, don't.
Yes, I'm going to get to that. Okay, so this is the Canadian picture. Now, when you see a lot or a little, you have to be careful. Here is 20%. So it's very rare that rags to riches movement is above 20%.
Yes.
All right, so that happens in 6 or 7. And in the paper, I list these places. Okay, and I'll map them shortly.
Okay.
All right.
So,
So
this
that-
extremeness in the American data is not in the Canadian.
The scales differ here, all right? But that is a piece of information that is out there that has an answer to it. Well, here's the Canadian map of the intergenerational cycle of bottom income. So the skill testing question, yeah?
How can you be on one axis at 0.35 and on the other at 0.6? Because
They have to add up.
they have to add up with the other three
Well, remember that.
quintiles to add up
Yeah,
to 1.
well, this is what I was trying to say. We are placing all individuals across the country in the national income distribution, not in the local income distribution. So there's more slack in that.
Okay.
And those are transition probabilities rather than cross tabulation.
Yes.
Because it's national, it's not bistochastic, so the numbers can be anything.
All right, so the skill testing question here is, where is the Canadian province of Manitoba? All right. Oops. It's right here. You probably don't even know the provincial boundaries, but this is Manitoba here, and it's almost all red. So this is the intergenerational cycle of poverty. For the most part, it's not correlated with provincial boundaries. And that's sort of interesting, because a lot of social welfare policy is in the provincial domain. Education, healthcare, income support for the very, very bottom are all provincial responsibilities. Layered on top of that is a system of federal transfers that equalize across provinces. So the fact that this is not correlated with provincial boundaries, I think, is a positive thing. So the answer to the question of where are these places are mapped out here. Green means very high mobility. That is, very low mobility, less than a 20% chance of falling into generational cycle of poverty. And that happens in some parts of Alberta and Saskatchewan in rural areas, and in some parts near the city of Toronto. But it's rather rare. Okay.
Can I just
Sure.
ask for clarification? when you're looking at location, is that the parents' location or the sons, or how do you account for mobility?
Excellent. Yeah. Yeah, I'm sorry, I went too quickly, so I should be very clear. Children are placed according to the postal code of their parents. And then they can go wherever they go. And that seems like a whole other paper. So mobility here could mean this place is very mobile, or it could mean this place gives kids the skills and the vision to move to opportunity. Okay? So where the child ends up is not taken into account. It's where they grew up as teenagers. Thank you.
But if there was no migration out of these areas, what would the meaning of this metric be? I mean, you're comparing to where they are in the national distribution.
Mm-hmm.
So suppose people didn't migrate out of where they were. Suppose you stayed in Northern Ontario.
Mm-hmm.
Then what would the meaning be of measuring mobility nationally when people don't relate to the whole of Canada? They just relate to the area they were born in.
I think, Michael, you're asking the right question, but that's sort of implicitly the question I was alluding to, that theory doesn't give me a guidance to what people relate to, and what's the social welfare function here, and how in that sense I should value the welfare implications of these statistics. That's a fair question, but I'm going to mash them all together because I don't know what weight to give them. All right? But certainly if you're concerned about intergenerational cycles of poverty as a policymaker, this at least brings some focus to these communities. That's fair. And I think in some cases, the stereotypical vision of Canada is sort of a one mill or one mine, one factory community, and no movement between them. I don't think that's true because of the, but clearly in the outlying areas, there are some issues of perhaps people not being in a position to move out or not wanting to move out to opportunity if it doesn't happen to come to them. The other thing I want to bring out that again was hinted at with the Israeli research that we might be interested in pursuing are gender differences. And this is not actually in the paper. This is the probability of intergenerational cycles of poverty for women along here and for men along here. And so if you are below the 45-degree line, the chances of intergenerational poverty are greater for women. Of my 266 communities, for the most part, the intergenerational cycle of poverty is greater for boys than it is for girls. So there's a whole gender dimension to this research that should be pursued with more care. Here's rags to riches movement. Since these boundaries don't really mean much to us, why don't I just skip over to the clustering analysis and then I'll conclude. Remember, I've got 8 different measures of mobility. And you can pick and choose which one have more welfare implications for you. There is absolute income mobility, relative income mobility. You recall the average level of parental income in the community. We've got positional mobility by the intercept and the slope, and then we have the transition matrices. So I'm just going to use a clustering analysis where I standardize all of these variables, mash them together into a metric, and then collect communities that look alike according to this metric. And this is what this unsupervised machine learning exercise leads to, a dendrogram of this sort. Each of these lines at the bottom are one of 266 census divisions, and then the machine couples them. And then it couples the couples that are most similar according to this metric. So what's important here is the vertical distance between the clusters. The algorithm clearly shows to me that the landscape can be divided into 2 groups. This vertical distance here collects these communities, and then there's all of these other communities. This is the landscape of us and them. And so I use this as a communication device to suggest to a policymaker, if you had one priority, this would be your first priority. this is what the landscape of us and them looks like in Canada. Okay? Again, you can see the province of Manitoba sticking out, and then small Aboriginal communities. So this is sort of where I sort of appeal to the Israeli discussion about fundamental barriers in society and how that relates to geography. A lot of this probably has to do with the decisions, the choices, the constraints that many Aboriginal communities will face, because they are the most populous groups in some of these outlying areas. There are actually big issues in Manitoba around this. It's a little bit more complicated than I'm making out to, but this should be a first public policy priority, at least to explore the extent to which this is a choice or a constraint. The actual landscape more accurately can be divided into 4 communities. So if you look at some of these communities, they are both rural and very urban. So the growth in the city of Toronto pulled up a lot of outlying communities. But then again, a huge oil boom helped parts of the oil communities around the oil sands rise up. So there's not one story there. And in the paper, we look at all the correlates under these communities. And certainly the Great Gatsby curve shows up within Canada as well as being a very important determinant or correlate. It's mostly inequality in the lower part of the income distribution, or at least in the middle and lower part, rather than very top-end 1% inequality that matters. Here is the landscape of us and them applied to Canada and the United States. So this is a paper that's in progress with my co-authors Marie Connolly and Catherine Hack of University of Quebec at Montreal. The data is a bit different. Now the data is, the children are measured at the age of 32. So measurement error is going to play more of a problem here. The income statistics are out of the analysis because we're not confident about the income measures. But you clearly, if you let the machine define this North American landscape, it doesn't pick out the Canada-US border as a distinguishing feature. In fact, large parts of Canada share an outcome with large parts of the US. It seems to me that's the big issue that drives mobility between these countries. For Canada, these groups are barely 2 to 3% of the population, but for the United States, a much bigger part. Okay? The algorithm is probably more accurately leading to a 4-fold division across the 2 countries. And here where the border shines out. So if you're really interested in cross-country differences between these 2 countries, you have to ask yourself what makes this region so different from the rest of the United States, because that's what's driving the cross-country differences. Canada shares that level of outcomes across these metrics with the United States, but the population is not large to drive it. So you can tinker on the margins of all kinds of things in the United States, teacher quality, moving to opportunity, but the big picture comes with dealing with what's going on here. The other way the border comes into effect is it's quite distinct here. I'm going to finish up, Ruben, don't worry. It's quite distinct here. And again, this is worthy of more exploration, but let's not forget, it's not just family that determines intergenerational mobility, and it's not just public policy that determines intergenerational mobility, but it's also the structure of labor markets. And again, this is a very important theme that's come out in the Israeli discussions that we've had. And it's inequality in the labor markets that drives intergenerational mobility in a sense as well. And inequality is probably greater on this side of the border than it is here. Okay? To be in the top 1% in Canada is quite lucrative. You have to have about $200,000. Okay? To be in the top 1% on the island of Manhattan is a very different thing. In the United States, you have to have $450,000 to be in the top 1%. So I suspect the structure of labor markets is also driving some of these differences. And then the countries share this sort of broad, high mobility area here. But I should caution, and I hope my discussion is careful here, that this particular paper is in flux in itself, and some of these data are going to change as we get to the final version. So let me conclude by just reiterating my 3 messages. And we've had a bit of a discussion here on that. We need to hold more than one thought in our minds to appreciate the meaning of mobility. And we don't have the structure from theory to tell us how to make those trade-offs yet. That said, this notion of movement, of upward movement, is important. It's important in the lives of people and for policy, and we should keep that metaphor in mind in driving our discussions. And if you wanted to focus in on the policy challenges in the United States, I suggest it's more than just sort of cream skimming of the innately talented and make sure that they get to the colleges or universities that they most deserve, but it's really lowering the chances that there'll be intergenerational cycles of poverty for children who face, relative to Canada, these absolute levels of income that are really quite low. Thank you for your patience.
The discussion of this paper and then Napoleon Stein, who was a geographer from the university.
Okay, thank you for the opportunity to speak. I'm the last discussant of the last paper and the last session, the last day, so I'll try and keep it.
Take your time then.
Try and keep with the bounds allocated. Just to appreciate the size of scale, we were talking about the difference between Canada and Israel. If you just submerge the whole state of Israel into Lake Michigan, no one would ever notice. So that gives you
Michigan is the United States.
Lake Michigan.
Lake Michigan is the United States.
Okay. Okay. So I enjoyed reading the paper. There's a hell of a lot of data analysis gone into this, and a lot of effort in creating some kind of data set that instead of just using the PSID or the British Household Survey panel, this is a whole new area of data that can be mined. I want to say, I thought I'd say two things, but in fact I'll say three things. I want to say a few words as I'm here on the geography ticket about how geography is conceived in this paper, slightly limiting in my opinion. Then I just say something about measurement of mobility based on work I've done with Michael Beanstalk in the past, and perhaps a few words on the issue of policy, which I hadn't planned to say, but it's been coming up time and time again, and I'll just conclude with that. We saw plenty of maps of basically places that are springboards for intergenerational transmission. So geography in that respect is just one of these initial conditions. It could also include education, health, and all these things affect earnings potential. So geography really, in this way of looking, is all about origins. It's where you're raised and not really where you end up. So it's like a conditioning factor, just like parents' income is, and education and so on. But as we see, even from the paper, if you move, let's say, from Manitoba to southwest Ontario, or from Manitoba to Newfoundland, or to northern provinces, let's say, those two different moves, and they can be the same distance, open up a whole suite of different economic opportunities. So I think that has to be taken into account. So I think we really have to move from geography to more spatially looking at what's going on here. So what are the spatial issues here? And in fact, in the paper you wrote, and I quote, geography is just a form of nonlinearity in the mobility process. So the question is it really? I think it's a bit richer than that, and that's the pitch I'm trying to make. So if we look at the inherently spatial issues that are at the core of all of this, number one, we have these 266 statistical areas, census divisions. Many of them are cities or municipalities. There's a really typical rank size distribution, because you've got two or three real massive ones and millions of little ones in the tail. And so you can't really get away from the fact you've got some real big cities here that are driving a lot of things going on. Big cities, we know, have Marshallian externalities, wage premium, and so on. Big cities make for more productive firms, for input sharing, for spillovers, labour market pooling, all these kinds of Marshallian externalities that then impact on the springboard effect of these polygons that we saw on the maps there. That's one issue. The next issue is the scale. Some of these geographic units are diverse in their size. You've got massive ones with nearly no one in them, and tiny ones packed with people. The costs of moving are enormous. Not just the social costs, the physical transportation costs of moving from one unit to another. Then we've also got the spatial skewness of the way all this is distributed across the Canadian, or let's say the Canadian landscape. You've got east of the Manitoba, Ontario, let's say, provincial line, you've got 200 of them, and west you've got about 50 or 60 of them. So again, that's also something that should really be taken into account if we're looking at these units as springboards for economic opportunity and for intergenerational transmissions. And finally, there's the key issue of what about neighbours? Again, each unit we can assume is affected somehow by its neighbours. So each one of these polygons, each one of these statistical community census districts, I've got it right, each one of them isn't totally independent of what's going on around it, and there's some dependence between the fact that they're contiguous in space. That can of course be captured in spatial econometric methods when it comes to estimation, but you've got issues here of spatial clustering, spatial autocorrelation that I think could also have something to say in the intergenerational transmission effect that you're looking for. So that's on the conception of space. Then point number 2 about measurements. I'll just put it all up. Okay, so we have 8 measures of intergenerational mobility being offered here. We have income mobility with 3 measures, and rank mobility. So we have income mobility has relative and absolute mobility, and the average income, and rank mobility is relative and absolute. And then we have the directional mobility, which is basically 3 kinds of scenarios, rags to riches, and what's going on at the bottom, and what's going on amongst the rich, and what's going on amongst the poor. Some of these are charted, some of these are mapped. We saw some of the outputs before. And then it's all homogenized through this clustering algorithm into us and them. I'm not sure which side are meant to be on, the us side or the them side, but I understand red is bad in terms of intergenerational, or red is low-level life chances, and the rest grey is higher level life chances. So there's a lot really to cope with here in again, and it can't all be put together in one framework, so it's, there's a lot going on, and how can it be perhaps amalgamated in a different way? So the key to all of this really is beta, because beta is the mean reversion, the relative mobility measure. And in work I've done with Michael, we've looking at regional income inequality, again, not really interregional generational transmissions, but regional differences across regions, but dynamic differences across regions. We suggested that we can take this beta, which is basically the key, the mean reversion relative mobility effect, and decompose it into three other estimates, or 3 other measures of mobility. One is the rank mobility, which is basically the absolute mobility. Another is the whether the inequality is increasing or decreasing, and you can look at it either through sigma or through Gini. We look at it through Gini. And then there's the final, what you call rags to riches, which is what we call leveling up or leveling down, whether the rich are becoming poorer or the poor are becoming rich. And as you said correctly, there's always displacement there, because if you're poor and you become rich, someone's rich is going to become a bit poorer. So in what we did, again, this is looking at inequality really in terms of rank. We estimated a Gini regression of y in a certain area on time t on its rank in a previous time period. From that we got the beta coefficients, and the beta coefficients we decomposed into 4 different measures of mobility, which I will put up now. So as you can see here, beta is decomposed into this capital gamma, which is the measure of, we interpret it as the measure of absolute mobility, and then you've got the Gini in relation to the previous Gini, which is a measure of the variance, or to what extent the mobility or the inequality is growing over time. And then you've got the yt over the yt minus 1, which is basically a measure of leveling up and leveling down. And just to locate this or to bring this into the Israeli discussion, we did this for Israeli data. This is regional data, so we're looking at regional inequality over time, so we're looking at the dynamics here. And we have 4 measures. For 9 Israeli regions, we divided Israel into 9 regions. 10-year window, which isn't very long, but it's due for extension because we have the data. What we can see here is when you take these 4 measures, some of them act together, some don't act together. Generally, over time, the beta sticks at around 0.8. But then we see that it's punctuated by certain periods of growth, and growth, of course, brings with it inequality. So we've got the spike at 94, 96, which we interpret as the heady days of the Oslo Peace Accords, which brought with it a lot of high expectations for growth. And then we have another growth period about 7 years, 6, 7 years later, which is part of the early high-tech boom of the end of the early 2000s with the NASDAQ. Everybody was basically being traded on NASDAQ at the time. The bottom line here is that if we look at regional inequality, inequality against across regions over time, things seem to be pretty from the 76 to 92 period, which is punched here in the far left side. We see that there's some kind of convergence, and then things seem to be pretty sclerotic. Okay, despite what we know about Israeli inequality, but at a regional level, things seem to be pretty sclerotic, and then they're punctuated by two peaks. But again, these 2 peaks aren't in all kinds of inequality, all kinds of mobility measures. They're only two out of the 4. The message from all of this is, in this kind of unified framework, you're getting a lot of information on mobility, maybe not geographic mobility, but at least dynamics, I should say, of income inequality in a slightly more unified framework than looking at 8 disparate measures and picking and choosing each time. Finally, I'll just say a word about policy, which I hadn't really prepared, but we've heard a lot about what can be done, especially in the Israeli context. And a lot of it is about making places more attractive, and then often transportation issues come in. If only we could get workers to work more efficiently. Busing systems, I don't know what, childcare for Arab housewives that need to get into the labour market but have no one to look after their kids and so on. This whole discussion and this whole fixation on transportation-based solutions for generating life chances, I think, is misplaced, in as much as that it says nothing about the quality of the jobs we're trying to get people into, or the quality of the life chances, or the quality of the runs of the land in which we want to place people. And as long as that discussion is just purely about transportation systems and childcare centres in order to increase labour participation rate and get people on the first rung of the ladder without even looking at what kind of rung it is. I think that that kind of public policy discussion is a bit lacking. I think tend on a more productive or positive note. I think a more productive way of looking at this kind of thing is to see to what extent barriers in society are the key issue. And of course, in the Israeli context, we're talking about doing army service or doing national service, and these are key points of entry into the labour market or into the ladder of life chances, and these have nothing really to do with geography. So while it would be seem to be apposite for me as representing geography here to say that let's talk about transportation as a policy issue, I really think that is a dead-end route to take, and I really think that the key is the barriers social barriers in society, and the social importance of the social networks, the old school tie, the army unit that you came from, and in the absence of all that, the chances of getting a step up on the ladder and then improving your life chances, I think, are limited. Thank you.
Thank you. I open the floor for discussion.
Can I ask about deflators? I understand that in Canada, Canada's the only country in the world, as far as I know, where there's regional deflators. So the cost of living in by province, there are data in Canada. So you can compare real incomes in say Manitoba with by having a right deflator for Manitoba with real incomes in Newfoundland. So in this mobility, that your intergenerational mobility, have you used those deflators, and so that you might have been upwardly mobile by moving out of Northern Ontario to Ottawa, but the cost of living in Ottawa is different to the cost of living in Northern Ontario. So the answer is yes, it's all taken into account.
You want me to answer now? No, actually, it's just the opposite. Now, perhaps you know more about the data than I do, but I didn't understand that those deflators went all the way back to the late 70s and early 80s when the parents' income is measured, but I will double check on that. We made no correction for that. So that's an important limitation. I do know that Raj and Nathan and their co-authors in the Quarterly Journal of Economics paper report that they did do that for the United States. So those deflators must be available for the United States, and they suggested that that had no impact on their results. But it remains an open issue with the Canadian data in the way that you described.
Don't they use the deflator, the income as deflator in a sense, because they do ranking? So it's not so important. Maybe.
No, absolutely.
Yeah, different question, Mark. The Chetty analysis, as far as I understood, there was quite a few correlates there that one of the papers lists, partly sort of racial, social segregation in communities. There was family structure, income inequality, some schooling proxies, but not poverty. And Alan might know this about it, but my understanding on that poverty wasn't as correlated. But in the Canadian data, from what I could tell, you were saying poverty was a correlate with the mobility levels. Is that right? Are there different correlates?
Yeah, we went through the exercise of correlates. Remember, there's two papers here, so I'm just going to speak about the Canadian paper that I wrote, and that was the most big part of the presentation. So I correlated the poverty rate in the community with all 8 of our indicators, and it's a very strong correlate. across all 8 in the way that you can imagine. So think of the intergenerational cycle of poverty. A child born to low-income parents is going to have a rougher time of it if their community poverty rate is higher. The very strongest correlates were the Gini coefficient, the ratio of median income to bottom 25% income, that is inequality in the lower half. Slightly less, the ratio of the 75th percentile to the 25th, but not the 99th percentile to the bottom. That was very strong. The strongest correlate was the fraction of immigrants in the community. And that was associated in a positive way. So if you lived in a community with a lot of immigrants in Canada, there was a lot more mobility. Now that can be both cause and consequence. It could reflect individuals. Family structure was there as well, but those were the strongest ones. So when I said that the Gatsby curve comes up within regions, it comes up quite strongly. I should say the version of this paper is out as a working paper, and all these correlates are there, so you can download that.
Miles, I showed you a graph on this. You know, what screams out at me when I read Chetty's paper, when I looked at your last graph, was race. And those red areas are heavily African American. I don't know if you put that in your regressions, but you don't need to run a regression to see that that's playing a major role. And I think Chetty shied away, maybe in part because he didn't have information in the tax data, but maybe for some other reasons from connecting to race. And it's also, I think, one of the reasons why looking at the time series in the U.S. would be really interesting, because pre-1964, there was no question that race had an enormous impact. It seems to linger. The other question I had, which is a little bit related, is you highlighted the role of Aboriginals in Canada. In the border states with the U.S., there's a high Native American Indian population in South Dakota, North Dakota, and just eyeballing it didn't jump out that it had the same kind of pattern as Canada. So I'm curious if you've looked at that, or are there any reasons why opportunity for Aboriginals in Canada would be different and more constricted than in the U.S., where in the U.S. it's a major problem on the reservations, as you know.
Just a question about the importance you attribute to the rags to riches story, and I wonder whether you're concerned in terms of policy issues, whether this can be taken and twisted around. The fact that there is a story of rags to riches often is used for not changing policies. So that if you can show an example of here's someone that started all the way at the bottom and at the top, our society is doing well. Whereas that's far from representing what's happening in society for most people that are born to rags. So I wonder what importance you attribute to this story, and whether there's a concern about it could be twisted around to doing nothing.
Maybe I can speak to that, and thanks for underscoring it. I think that's just my point, that these stories really resonate in public policy discussion, and in some sense, as you suggest, they can be used to motivate the fact that, hey, we all do live in a land of the American dream or the Canadian dream. But if, I hope it came out clear, what I'm doing is using that as a hook. I'm told in policy circles that this is an important thing. And intuitively, I can understand that. And hooray for Shania Twain. And hooray for all children who become all that they can be. But the bottom line here is the way to promote that is to worry about people who are stuck in the bottom as a whole. And I think that's the message that has to come out. Not, as I suggested, just sort of cream skimming a little bit and then satisfying yourself with the fact that the most innately talented do make it, or perhaps through luck. So if we reduce the intergenerational cycle of poverty, that's the best way to promote upward mobility. And I think Alan phrased, I think, some of the major conclusions of that paper quite correctly. Obviously, there are big challenges in understanding differences across countries, and this cross-country comparisons, I think, helps highlight one of the big issues that the United States has to deal with. There are Aboriginal communities throughout Canada on the border as well, but they're not as isolated as some of those up in the very north, and that's where they sort of shine out. Because, well, you can't open a casino there, you can't move to the city there.
I guess what we call the north, you call the south.
Oh, most definitely.
The last question for the paper section of our conference.
Whenever you do a paper with tons of numbers, a lot of volunteers show up and suggest you do a lot more, but I'd be keen to understand the role of geographic migration in mobility in Canada. So to begin with, in a sense, to do it not by parental location, but by the kid's location. And also possibly some kind of measure of high mobility regions, but what does the mobility take place by the kids moving out or of moving up within the region? And in the same vein, I'd kind of be interested to know, would the picture look very different if we're doing all by stochastic matrices, that is, defining the mobility matrix completely within the region itself. But the second, which is definitely a very different paper, but one of the things I'd kind of be keen to know is can you relate essentially economic growth in these regions to mobility? And one way, of course, to do this would be to take a closer look at mobility parameters and level of income parameters, not change parameters, but really level of income parameters to try to understand, because you have enough regions for it to be meaningful.